Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Daily Maverick webinar on Thursday, the 18th of February. I'm Karen Allen, and thanks to our sponsors, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, for supporting the Daily Maverick and for making this event possible. Now, over the next hour, we're going to be discussing the climate crisis, what lessons can be learnt from the current COVID-19 pandemic to recalibrate and to re-energize the climate debate, and turn what threatens to be a global catastrophe into, well, an opportunity. Sounds pretty counterintuitive, doesn't it? Well, it may seem counterintuitive, but I hope as the conversation progresses, we'll be able to shed light on that and perhaps even change a few entrenched positions or simply offer a different way to frame the debate on climate change. Now, I'm honoured to share this platform for the webinar with two highly esteemed figures committed to issues of climate justice: Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland and chair of the Elders, and whose work on global justice has firmly positioned the impact of climate change on the development agenda and highlighted how some of the most marginalized communities across the world are disproportionately affected. Welcome, Mary Robinson. Also, Saliem Fakir. He's the executive director of the African Climate Change Foundation, which has recently launched the Africa-Europe Climate Alliance. It's an initiative which is aimed at jump-starting or elevating issues of climate justice internationally and highlighting areas of common ground between Europe and the African continent's efforts to address pressing climate issues. Thank you to both of you for joining us. If I may, a few introductory remarks, please, to pick up on a couple of broad themes. Mary Robinson, lovely to see you. Just briefly, the foundation which you established has focused on the impact of climate justice and economic development, ideas which really not too long ago were considered mutually exclusive or polar opposites. Do you think there's now a consensus that development policy cannot afford to ignore the impact of climate change, and so they should go hand in hand? Have you seen a shift in the sands?
I've seen a shift, but I'm not sure whether we've quite reached a consensus, which, hopefully we will. And I think this linking now between Europe and Africa, Africa and Europe is going to be helpful with the Africa-Europe Foundation and indeed the Climate Alliance, which was also launched. And it's nice to see Saliem, because we were together for the launch of both. On the 2nd of December, it was the Africa-Europe Foundation, and then on the 9th of December, the Climate Alliance of the Africa-Europe Foundation. And I'm on the board of one of the founding partners, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation for African Leadership. But to your question, Karen, there certainly is more awareness. But let me just take an example. I don't want to be unfair on this, but I think it's worth pointing out. The United Kingdom was admired by me and others for inserting into legislation a commitment to 0.7% for development aid. Yeah, it's now president of the next COP in Glasgow and has decided to cut to 0.5 its development aid. Now, there's a lot of resistance. 4 prime ministers have said shouldn't do that, but so that's why I say we haven't got a consensus. We haven't really understood fully the connections.
Yeah, and Europe's falling behind, save for a few other countries, according to some of the recent reports. We'll probably pick up on that as the discussions progress. Thank you for that, Mary Robinson. Saliem Fakir, are we facing a unique constellation of stars, if you like, that make you more optimistic about climate justice now than ever before? I'm asking that because we've got a pandemic which has exposed how interdependent we are as a global community, a president in the United States who's committed to making the US carbon neutral by 2050, and a series of devastating wildfires and hurricanes which have served to certainly concentrate the mind and drive home the message that rising annual global temperatures mean that we're likely to see more and more such events. Are you optimistic at the moment, given the alignment of these stars?
So let me, and wonderful to meet Mary again. We had such a fantastic launch on the 9th of December, and Karen, to see you again. I just wanted to quickly just touch on something important about the Climate Alliance, which I think, once it will set the scene for the question that you just asked. There was a high-level group report, which Mary was part of, that basically is an output of the Africa-Europe Foundation. And I think it's important to understand. That's it, yes, that's the report. And Mary is also a honorary president of the Africa-Europe Foundation and a champion for the Climate Alliance. So it's wonderful to have together with Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia. So the development nexus, the climate development nexus, is really at the core of the report. And it's, I think, profound to understand that, because most people talk of climate issues as if it's only about catastrophe and risk and vulnerability to poor people. And that is obviously very true. But we are saying in the Climate Alliance report, and the narrative we want to build, is that there's a developmental component to climate issues that needs to be now at the heart and center of the discussions, not just about, that aid should be tilted towards just about managing disasters and vulnerability and risk, but aid should also, and other forms of assistance and economic reforms have to talk about climate as a developmental agenda. It's not only important for Africa, it's also important for Europe. We are at the cusp of something significantly revolutionary, and you just saw the book that Bill Gates has put out, and I think he's touched on that, is that we have moved from a normative debate, which was very much a part of held by the environmental movement for a long time in the 1970s, and I'm sure, Mary, when you were Prime Minister, you were at the heart of some of these discussions. We then moved in the late 80s and 90s to a compliance mode. We are now moving to a massive structural and economic transformation mode, where we are seeing a technology wave that is going to come to play. They hold promise and a danger. The promise is that it can lift us into a 21st century that is totally decarbonized, and we don't have to breathe, the kind of toxic air that most of us would be breathing if we had fossil fuels as the main engine of that. And the second part is that and this is the reason why we have the Africa-Europe Partnership discussion, we also have to be aware of the inequality that can be deepened if this is not done in a just and equitable manner, this transition and this transformation that will come in the next decade or so. So I think it's very important for us to understand it's a double-edged sword. It's not just one optimistic story for one group of people. It might actually be quite negative and exclusive for another group of people. And the African continent has to be included in that new wave of technology development.
And I actually
Karen, could I just build a little bit on what Saliem was saying? Because I think it's really important to reflect on a different relationship between Africa and Europe, a much more even, equal relationship. And Europe has to recalibrate completely in its relationship with Africa, with the African Union, and with African countries. And this needs to be a genuine partnership. And that means it can't be just the African Union and the European Union, or just the countries of the two continents. It has to be a whole fabric of relationships, a network of networks. And that is actually at the heart of the Africa-Europe Partnership and the Climate Alliance. And Saliem mentioned that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and myself were asked to be honorary presidents, which we were happy to be. Honorary president doesn't mean very much. By the way, Saliem, I was a president of Ireland, not prime minister, but I was a non-executive president, different from president of South Africa. But anyway, what I wanted to say was, because we were asked to be honorary presidents, two women, if you like, patrons of this Africa-Europe Foundation, we decided to add another relationship, which is the relationship of women leaders. And we've had our first meeting, and I just want to say, what do we focus on? We focused on the issues of the need to address the impact COVID is having, particularly on African countries, the debt problem, the problem of fiscal space. And we had Kristalina Georgieva speaking about her special drawing rights issue. And then we had Ngozi speaking on the lack of equitable access to vaccines. This doesn't seem to be climate, but of course it is. It's the precondition to African countries being able to align their recovery with a green future, as we all need to do.
I'm so glad you've mentioned that, actually, because that's going to link into one of the poll questions that I want to put to people watching and participating in this webinar in just a moment. Of course, people who are watching this, we want you to give your input. Please submit some questions. We'll be more than happy to put them to our two guests. Before we get into the meat of the discussion, I'd really like to take a quick snapshot poll to gauge audience views, and it's really picking up on something that Mary Robinson just alluded to. I wanted to ask that, apart from reducing carbon emissions, because of the lockdown measures that we're seeing as a result of COVID-19, and far fewer of us are traveling by car or plane, do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has put climate change higher up the international agenda, or has it overshadowed it? So that's the poll question. Has the COVID-19 pandemic put climate change higher up the international agenda, or has it overshadowed it? You can vote live, and we should be able to give you an indication of which way that vote went in just a second. We've got nearly 200 people at the moment following this webinar. I know that number is likely to creep up. And as we wait for those results to come in, perhaps I could just ask a question of you, Mary Robinson. We're having this discussion a little over 24 hours after South Africa has embarked on this major COVID-19 vaccine trial rollout. That has brought with it a debate about vaccine equity and access. And I'm wondering, has that context really helped to set the scene for far more urgent discussions about climate justice? And can you just tell us a little bit more about the dynamics of that?
Well, certainly there is much more awareness. After all, Secretary General Guterres of the UN spoke yesterday to the Security Council, and he was angry. He said there are 130 countries that have not had any vaccines at all. And, you know, there's a selfish rolling out, and it just won't work because we're not going to be secure until everybody's secure. And we have the COVAX. It needs to be much more supported. He's called on the G20 to form a special task force to address this issue. And I hope that will bring home, you know, we're all in this together. We need a global solidarity, and the elders are very keen to see much more multilateral sort of support for solidarity and equity in this and in other areas. So, you know, it is really important that the Africa-Europe Foundation brings home the links, the incredible neighborhood relationships that we need to build on in order, and this is one of them, equity in access to vaccines.
And part of that, before I make reference to the poll results, part of that is building resilience. So when there are external shocks, for example, like a pandemic, societies globally, and Africa in particular, are in a much, much better position to withstand those shocks. Is that part of the logic behind this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the building of resilience, the adaptation has never had the same weight in the climate debate as mitigation. It actually needs to now. And there's a commitment to it rhetorically, but not fiscally, not in financing. And that's really important.
Thank you. Saliem, we'll come to you in just a moment, but let me just refer to this poll that we've just taken. Just a reminder, the question was, has the COVID-19 pandemic put climate change higher up the international agenda, or has it overshadowed it? We did have poll results a moment ago, and my screen's gone blank. So if you can bear with me for a second, we should be getting those results through. It feels a bit like the Eurovision Song Contest, waiting for those results to come through. You know what? I will get those in just a moment, because the poll. I'm going to get someone to actually send the poll results to me. Aha, here we go. The wonders of dual technology. I've now got them on WhatsApp. So those that believe that it's higher up on the agenda, 36%. Those who believe that climate change has been overshadowed by the pandemic, 63%. 36% versus 63%. I think that suggests there's an awful lot more work to do to be able to build that connection and build that intellectual connection and connection in terms of action and taking things forward in terms of development policy. Can I put a question to Saliem? You've set up this alliance, and clearly many people feel that the climate change debate has been overshadowed by sort of more immediate issues, if you like, such as the pandemic. As you launch the Africa-Europe Climate Alliance, you speak of opportunities and a chance to change the narrative on climate change. That poll suggests there's a heck of a lot of work still to be done. Can you therefore explain what kind of opportunities do you have in mind that might actually change the tide?
So maybe if I can interpret the poll just as a foundational comment, I do think that in terms of the media attention, surely the COVID and the crisis around the distribution, equitable distribution of the vaccines is definitely overshadowing. But I think on the quiet, actually, if you look at the massive investments that are planned, happened during the COVID phase. In fact, the European Recovery Plan has a significant amount of funds allocated towards green recovery. They call it, in fact, the Green Deal. China was also in the position to declare last year 2060 targets on carbon neutrality. So certainly for strategic geopolitical continents and country, the COVID crisis was an opportunity to actually declare a determined and ambitious agenda to actually use the crisis to reinvigorate the economies into much faster track of decarbonization. And you see now the Biden administration is also starting to come forward. So I think as we build up to COP26, there will be a lot more discussion about this. But I think importantly, the crisis is not over because there's a massive, not only vaccination problem that needs to be distributed more widely on the African continent, has to be made accessible. There's an entire debt recovery problem that needs to be addressed, and it's going to be an important part of the discussion about if we try to engineer or try to bring about a positive contribution of climate issues, particularly around green recovery. You cannot solve that while you still have a debt crisis. You have to actually try to address both simultaneously, and they have to talk to each other. There is significant potential for leapfrogging technology shifts on the continent, particularly with cheaper, cleaner technology, and that could have a very positive
We're losing your sound a little. Oh, carry on, Saliem. We lost your sound briefly. Yep, carry on.
So two sectors we see as primary to Africa's growth and development. Can you hear me now?
Yep, that's great. Carry on. That's fine if you turn the camera off briefly. Yep.
The key to Africa's growth and development is the energy sector and agriculture, because agriculture is still at the core of economic activities in Africa. Majority of the people are employed there, and energy is a vital component of reviving a broader economic base than currently is the case. It's important for another important area that is of importance to the African Europe Foundation is the expansion of digital access and digital technologies. And the third is the improving and enhancing agricultural activity that has more potential for exports and food security and increased improved nutrition because of the right kind of food. So if I can leave it at that. Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, those are fairly sort of long-term plans, but I know that you have, and we'll talk about that shortly, sort of, in a sense, short-term, medium-term, and long-term recommendations as to how you take things forward. But Mary Robinson, can I perhaps put a question to you from one of the viewers to this to the webinar. It's from Michael Small, and he says that given that climate issues are so tightly interconnected with the global market economy, there has to be a structural change. It's not just about climate justice, but also about economic justice. It is hard to see how you're going to bring on board big oil and gas mining, food, etc. giants into this. So is structural change embedded into the plan? And if so, how? And if not, why? I know it is embedded to the plan, so perhaps you can shed some light on that.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's a really important question. I don't like the language, even though it's, kind of UN language, and I think President Biden uses this language. I don't like the language "build back better." Yeah. I don't like "build back" at all. Yeah. Yeah. I want to build forward with equality, justice, fairness, security, and a different economic model, basically, because that is what we need. And if I could maybe follow Saliem in commenting a little bit on the poll that was taken of the question. Let me put it in personal terms. I was more optimistic this January than I was in January 2020, because in January 2020, before we knew about COVID and its impacts, I didn't see the ambition. I didn't see countries going to make that significant change in the preparations for the conference that was to take place in Glasgow in November 2020. And then COVID hit. Nobody would want a COVID. But actually, COVID has taken us out of our comfort zone. And it has not done it equally at all, as we know. Yeah. It has actually exacerbated all of the inequalities. And it has exacerbated them to such an extent that it has also shown the intersectionality. So now people are thinking of racial justice, gender justice, economic justice, justice for people with disabilities in the same. We're getting out of our silos, which is actually really very important. And we're beginning to think more about what kind of world, and also how fragile our humanity is, that we can be knocked sideways in every sense, in deaths, in health issues, mental health issues, economic issues, livelihoods, all by a virus we can't even see. And we know it's not the only pandemic. So suddenly, we're open, I think, and we've more empathy for the idea that we need to deal with this climate issue urgently.
But isn't it quite a cluttered political agenda? Because with minds being concentrated very much on dealing with the here and now of the pandemic, it's very easy, and that sort of speaks to some 60% of people who responded to the poll, for the climate issue simply politically to lose the potency, simply because there's so much else to do.
I think that's where children and young people have been so helpful, because they know that they won't have a future. They won't have a future unless we change course and get on track for a 1.5 degree world. And they're right. So I think that pressure will continue. And I do agree with Saliem. We are seeing very significant changes, including in relation to oil and gas. BlackRock, the big investor, has just told oil and gas companies it's invested in, it's the biggest investor in the world in oil and gas, as I understand it, that they have to start saying they're going to be zero carbon by 2050 and work backwards and where they're going to be, etc. in their invest, or BlackRock won't invest, others won't invest. That's the beginning of a real change. The head of the OECD, retiring yesterday, said we need a big fat price on carbon. That will move things. So we are seeing things. I'm more hopeful.
Can I put another question then? We've got one from Klaus Schmidt. Maybe I can put this to you, Saliem. Klaus says, do you share the optimism about South Africa's role in a clean, green hydrogen future? Or is that another deflection by interested parties in some industries trying to survive while still continuing on an unsustainable growth trajectory?
So I think South Africa, I would have, like Mary, share with her that I would have been rather despondent in 2020 about South Africa's shift in a new direction. And, Gramsci had a word that we're in an interregnum. We're in between the old world and the new world. So we are stuck. And I think the momentum towards the new world is going to be given greater impetus, given the geopolitical shifts that are happening in the climate space. And I want to emphasize that this is on the political radar at the moment, precisely because the climate issue has moved from a pure environmental issue to becoming mainstream economic development issue. And so you'll see a lot more momentum and discussion. It's happening even within the Africa-Europe discussions, especially around the implications of the Green Deal and its impact on the African continent. The question for the Africans is this going to be a barrier for further growth and development, given that we have to export into Europe, or is Europe going to impose new kinds of standards that will be using the green agenda to kind of finance its own technology wave and the growth of markets on the African continent? So I think for South Africa, there are important signposts of progress. The one is that there's now a big push to scale up the renewables component. It's not enough, I have to say that. We need a lot more capacity that will come from cheaper sources of energy, and renewables are definitely one of them. There is now a massive debate about deregulating, at least increasing the input of embedded generation, which is outside of the main utility, which is Eskom. And the third part is the potential for the municipalities to be actually procure their own power. I have not seen such an emphasis also put on the development of hydrogen corridors in South Africa. And in fact, I'm very encouraged by that. So we are not there at the level of ambition we want, but that will grow. There's also a promising development in that we have the Presidential Coordinating Committee for Climate Change, which has been appointed by President Ramaphosa in December. And they will have their first meeting actually tomorrow on the 19th. And that's a very important development in South Africa. The Presidential Commission on Climate Change is housed within the presidency. It will have the power to shape a more stronger, ambitious decarbonization program for South Africa that will have to be investable. It can't just be sort of paper rhetoric, but it will have to be translated into investable initiatives as we go along. So these are, I think, positive. So fair to say we're stuck in the old, we are trying to move to the new, and that tension is still there, that friction. Yeah.
Something that really struck me in your report, and this is for both of you, but perhaps I'll get May Robinson.
Sorry, there's a big echo.
Yeah, we are hearing an echo, aren't we? Not sure why that is. Let's try again.
Now.
Oh, it's gone. I think it's gone again. Yeah. Okay. I mean, one of the things that really resonated with me about trying to convey this, the nexus, if you like, between development and climate issues was one reference that was made in your report by the high-level group that reminds us, Mary Robinson, that energy and food are the fuels that power people, that enable economic activity, i.e. they're the vital ingredients of social economic development. But obviously, that gives a very, very clear link that if people are unable to grow food, they're unable to farm sustainably, they're unable to take care of the environment, that it has direct economic consequences in terms of economic development. But how do you translate that into practical action? And just to add a question that's been offered by one of the, from Mabale Badusa, what is the role of civil society in trying to translate that into practical action?
Well, thank you, because that's a question that's very much on my mind at the moment. I'm really very glad, as Saliem has explained, that energy, clean energy access and food systems are the two key issues of the Climate Alliance report. And actually the next meeting in March of our Women Leaders Network of Africa and African and European women leaders is on food systems, because we know we have a summit in September on food systems. The situation is different between Africa and Europe. Europe needs to address overconsumption, waste, the need to have a circular economy that gets rid of waste. And so it's going to be very interesting to have, the dialogue at all levels. But I'm just looking forward to the women leaders on this, because we have some really smart women who are very key to the preparations for this summit. And, what COVID has taught us it's a number of interesting lessons. I'll just repeat them very quickly. First of all, that actually collective human behavior matters. That's what's protecting us from the virus. Yeah. So collective behavior and civil society participation in it is going to be very important. It's going to be different. As I said, we waste a third of the food in the world. Isn't that shocking? Yeah. And most of it is waste in developed countries. The food that's thrown out, but there's also a waste in not having efficient systems and not having, capacity to keep food refrigerated and so on. A very interesting elder, I'm chair of the elders, as you mentioned, a very interesting elder, Ela Bat, of the Self-Employed Women's Association in Africa, kept pleading with us as elders, why don't we look more at the fact, why do we consume food produced more than 100 kilometers from where we live? Very interesting point. And I think the world is going to move much more to more local in food systems, because that doesn't carry the emissions of travel for a start. And we may have less choices, but so what? If we don't have all year round in Europe, for example, the luxury of imports from all around the world that carry that emissions burden that we never admit.
That's a massive norms change, though, in terms of consumer behaviour.
Yes, it is. But COVID has taught us we can have changes in behaviour, and very often they're led by women in the family. So that's another reason to get women leaders involved in this. Also, COVID, the other lessons from COVID are that government matters, that science matters, and we need to listen to the climate scientists as we listen to the health experts, and that compassion matters. It's interesting. We are seeing more openness to the other suffering more, because it has it's like a mirror. It has shown us the inequalities.
You mentioned government, actually, and perhaps I can put this, it was just a question I was thinking of to Saliem, is that we have seen the role of government. We've also seen the role of the private sector as well, working alongside the government. In terms of your initiative, is there an enhanced role for government, a revived role for multilateralism to try and ram home some of the concrete proposals that you have as part of this initiative?
So if I can just answer your question in three parts. I think the first part is for the viewers to be aware that we have massive agricultural potential on the continent. In fact, most of it actually, if you were able to build infrastructure and irrigation and also utilize rain-fed agricultural potential, we can actually feed the continent. In fact, Zimbabwe for many years was a bread basket for Southern Africa. Mozambique has that potential, Angola does. So we shouldn't lose sight of the massive potential there is. The second part, the paradox of Africa is that we got vast energy resources. Not let's forget oil and gas and coal, but wind and solar resources. And yet there are about 600 million people without proper energy access. In fact, if you go to Nigeria, 70% of people still use diesel generation and they could be doing with something else. So that does tell us that the role of government is very crucial, and government has to begin to think of different ways in which it can encourage the right kind of development. It will have to be very crucial, and that is leadership, political leadership, being able to capacitate the state with the right technical expertise, and then being able to mobilize resources that are both public and private in a way that is attuned and aligned to the development agenda. You could have a lot of private investment, but it might not be in the interest of specific communities. It might actually be counter to those. So we don't want a kind of rapacious, parasitic privatization model, and I think we need to get away from that. And I think the third part is that what is wonderful about the AEF is that it's got several strategy working streams that are trying to look at the detail of how this could actually happen in reality in a practical way. So they have members of some top experts and thinkers from both continents trying to figure this out and to try to deliver a package of practical solutions that involves both Europe and Africa to take this forward. And we hope that within the next 18 months that some of these solutions will be put on the table. But they're not only looking at energy and agriculture, they're actually looking at digital technologies, health, and many other areas, and transport as well, as a cross-cutting issues, and try to take an integrated approach. What is unique about, I think, the Climate Alliance and the work of the AEF is that it's a very strong developmental focus in the way we think about climate. And it's also not a narrow, just a pure climate agenda, but it's also trying to bring in other aspects that would ordinarily be forgotten about. So we think that the world is moving to a more integrated models of development, and the climate agenda has to be part of that.
You've talked about more innovative ways of being able to produce and access energy while sort of, in a sense, growing development opportunities within the continent. I just wonder if you could just sort of answer a quick question from Sean Schneier, who says, is there potential, for example, for North Africa to supply renewable energy to Europe? So a reversal of the relationship.
So, in fact, there was a massive program called Desertec. I don't know, Mary, if you remember that, which was to have massive solar technologies developed, mostly led from Morocco, but have transmission lines across into Europe. But of course, then 2011 happened, which was the Arab Spring, and that put a stop and disrupted the development of this. There is still now renewed discussions for the revival of Desertec in one form or the other to look at that potential again. And it's also linked to the development of hydrogen as an export, particularly to Europe, because we can produce it in Africa at much cheaper costs, and there would be insufficient amount of it being able to be produced in Europe itself. So you do need Africa's participation and Africa's resources to be able to scale up hydrogen production, because that's going to substitute for gas and many other fossil-based energy sources in the future. So that's looking to be revived again. And I don't know, Mary, if you want to add to that, because those are really interesting discussions that are happening at the moment between Europe and many other partners.
No, I mean, I agree that, there is a potential there. I'm also interested in Africa having the capacity to develop its own sources for African countries, obviously, as you would be. But if I may, Karen, I'd like to kind of switch to the other side of this, which is nature-based solutions. Mm-hmm. I know that Vera Songwe, the head of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, is about to have a major report, which would be really important for the African continent, because, and for the world. I mean, we have this convention on biodiversity in China this year, and we saw the UN report in May 2019 about the incredible loss of biodiversity in the extinction of species. And unfortunately, that's it's a real problem. And even oil exploration can be devastating. There's a project in Botswana which would be devastating for a huge wildlife area there and vital area for biodiversity. So again, how do we align our recovery, our building forward, align it also with living more closely with nature? I think this is absolutely vital, with getting back into harmony with our planet for the sake also of future generations.
But money talks. And one question I want to ask, really, again, maybe ask you, Mary Robinson, how do you de-risk investments in Africa? So, there seems to be a lot of appetite to invest in, for example, greener, cleaner energies on the continent, or in other initiatives that conserve local ecosystems, that preserve the environment. How do you make it worth investors' while investing in it and making those investments not risk-free, but certainly de-risk them?
Yeah, I think this is something that Vera Songway is very keen on, to have what she calls, because this is the language used, shovel-ready, which is the wrong for. It's wrong for green projects, but it's the language. To invest in, and we just need to shift the narrative. I mean, I'd love Saliem to come in on this too, where we do see that nexus between climate and development, and it's clean energy, clean jobs. In Europe, a lot of it will be, the kind of jobs in looking at how we heat our houses. A lot of jobs there in, having, much more attention to that. But in Africa, what is needed is the projects on clean energy and the incentives to invest in. And I think this is something that actually the Africa-Europe Foundation, with our strategy committees, will be able to come up with and help, because these are not generated by governments mainly. They're generated by the private sector and by investors. And so, I know from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation how keen Mo Ibrahim is on this aspect.
Yes. Now, listen, can we just pause for a second? Because you've both been making a very strong case about alignment between Africa and Europe, and a bolstering of that relationship. But I'm wondering if you're actually convincing those that are participating in the webinar. So I want to conduct another quick poll. And the question in this next poll is, instinctively, and this is for everyone who's participating on the webinar, instinctively, do you see an alignment of goals between Africa and Europe when it comes to addressing climate change, or are they poles apart? Are they really natural partners, as our two panelists would suggest? I'd like you to vote on that. We'll give you the results in just a few minutes. We're going to sort of move on to practicalities, just whilst we're waiting for those poll results to come through. Can I put a question to you, Saliem? It's from Karen Hewson, who's asked, how do you see low-tech, i.e. simple passive solar, versus high-tech, i.e. photovoltaic solar panels, green technologies, having in the recovery? High-tech solutions need scarce resources, complicated manufacturing, and highly skilled workers. If education and training is sorely lacking, how can we make a green economy work? Are we talking about shared capacity building, shared intellectual knowledge? Could you answer that question, please, Saliem?
So I just wanted to mention something that, I sort of slipped my mind. And one of the things that we are looking at in the EEF is to look at the finance piece. And in fact, that's a new work stream that is developing. In order to answer the sort of question that has been asked, I think the one thing that I know is that in talking to technology players, across the continent, one of the things we lack is sort of a ambitious regional approach where the technology standards are very clear, and we can then find ways to find the key thing for scaling, by the way, Karen, is that the cost of capital in Africa is very high.
Exactly.
We've got to find ways to reduce that.
Yeah.
So it's not so much the technology, it's actually the cost of the capital. Mature technologies tend to be much cheaper. Other technologies, for example, for hydrogen, require a lot more investment, and it's better that advanced countries scale that up so that we benefit from being laggers in that sense, that where countries scale it up like Japan, South Korea, China and others, we get the benefit of their experience and their learnings and their actually cost reductions that come from them implementing it. So for us, I think it's crucial that we have some sort of a regional approach to this question of is it this versus that? But we also need to maximize three things: cost effectiveness. We need to be able to integrate it and align it with our economic development objectives. And thirdly, it must be able to create as many jobs as we can. And fourthly, which is important, we forgot another piece, which is the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement is now launched.
Yes.
Big emphasis on inter-regional trade and actually manufacturing and development of these products on the continent. That has to be part of the alignment with Europe, because it can't be the old ways of doing where we just import stuff. We actually have to use the trade mechanisms that have been developed in Africa to take a unified ability to develop the capacity and the skills on the continent. And scale will help you to concentrate the skills and capacity development. We don't have to wait for universities to turn them out. You start doing the projects and you try to develop the skills and so on. We've learned that in South Africa, by the way, with massive rollout of renewables. You don't have to wait for these skills. You can start repurposing engineers in another field to work in this sector. These are ways in which you can achieve that.
Okay,
I'd like to come in on this just briefly, Karen.
Yes, sure.
Maybe referring to the short-term immediate measures that the Climate Alliance is envisaging. And I just read two of them. Facilitating technical assistance measures for medium to large-scale investment in grid, off-grid and mini-grid schemes, as well as programs for restoring soils and preserving natural ecosystems. Secondly, rolling out clean cooking solutions to ensure a safe daily environment for women and youth in rural and urban settings, fight deforestation, cut black carbon pollution, address existing and future pulmonary and related health issues for women, children. And now I say that because after we've talked about food systems, the next system that the women leaders will be talking about is actually access to clean energy and clean cooking. And we will be very bottom up. We will listen to some entrepreneurs, because we have very good women entrepreneurs in Africa, and women who are looking at food systems and access to energy in Europe as well. And there's a linkage. Saliem has his Africa Climate Foundation. I was on the board of the European Climate Foundation for 9 years, and I'm on their advisory council now. And there's great links there as well. So I just wanted to make sure, we will be talking about issues that are real for people. And that's the important thing.
And there's some practical. Well, let's just go back to our poll to see whether you're convincing our webinar viewers about this share that Europe and Africa are natural parties. I mean, again, the question was instinctively, do you see an alignment of goals between Africa and Europe when it comes to addressing climate change? Or are they poles apart? Are they natural partners? Are you ready for this? 25% believe there's definitely an alignment. 28% have said they would need more information to answer the question, and 46% believe they're still poles apart. Possibly not that surprising a result, but certainly I think when you're speaking about very practical measures that can be taken in the short term, the obvious question I have is who pays for this? Who pays for this? Are we relying very much on private sector initiatives to be able to deliver some of the things that, Mary Robinson, you mentioned just a moment ago? Or is there a pot of money that you are looking to that would be diverted to these kind of priority projects?
Do you want, Mary, do you want to answer?
Yeah, sorry, I thought Saliem was going to come in on that. First of all, a lot of it is going to be self-interest of private sector entrepreneurs, those who are engaged, because it's literally identifying areas that are already being worked on where it is possible to get more resources, and then go and get those more resources. It's almost like back to the earlier conversation, having more projects that are really worthwhile being augmented and more resourced because they're now known about, and
yes.
So. At all levels, and then there is an interest from the European Union and the African Union in the work of the African Climate Foundation. They were there at the launch of it at a very senior level. So I think governments recognize governments don't create that many jobs on the ground. It's up to this network of networks, this relationship building. And I take the point from the polling. We have work to do. And I think a lot of that work is that Europe has not, in the past, been seen as a real equal partner with Africa and African countries. And that's what has to change.
Saliem, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on two things. The role of private sector, which I think it's very important for us to move away from a kind of sort of involvement of the private sector that's not aligned to the kind of necessary structural reforms that have to happen that address deep inequality, given the crisis in COVID. So we can't have the same old model of private investment that is about just returns without a strong social dividend and, in fact, a just transition. So I would be cautious about that because there will be a massive backlash to that kind of model. And we really have to rebalance the role of private sector that has to be aligned to a more developmental agenda. And it has to happen in the African continent in that way. Most private finance in Africa try to exploit the high returns because of the high levels of interest rate that can be earned because of the cost of capital. So we need to move away from that. So I just want to say that. Secondly, I think that to come to the poll survey, I would say that that Europe, the shift in the globe is also a factor influencing the way Africans relate to Europe today. So there are other important geopolitical players on the continent, like China, I would say even Gulf states and others, that is changing, that Europe itself has to understand that the old model of sort of colonial and post-colonial kind of relationship we have to move away from it. Europe has to understand that actually there are a lot more other options for Africa to engage with partners who are equally well-resourced. And by the way, the US is also going to pursue a very different agenda on the continent, moving away from security to more investment-oriented. And it's going to, in fact, compete with Europe. Whether they are friends today, they will definitely compete for interests on the continent. So it's not the same old context anymore. And the crisis in the discussions between the Africa-Europe negotiations is precisely because Europe thinks it's still in the old mode of negotiations where it was the only partner. We have to actually, that world has changed. And I think that's the lesson that's coming out of the discussions at the moment.
Well, to both of you, and Mary, let's put this to you first of all, and we really don't have a lot of time. We've got less than 5 minutes now. Just by way of wrapping up, a number of high-profile climate events on the agenda. COP26 hosted in the UK, COP27 will be held in Africa in 2022. How can you capitalize on these events to turn the alliance into a vehicle for concrete action?
It's very true. We actually have this UK, Italy-led Climate and Development Conference coming up in March. We have Biden's conference on the Earth Day, the 22nd of April. And he has now, the US has now included developing countries in that. It was supposed to be for the rich countries, but now it's broadened out. And then, of course, we have the Convention on Biodiversity, the Summit on Food Systems, the COP. I mean, and the equality generation, the Beijing +25 being also marked this year. I mustn't forget that. So it's a huge year of trying to use these opportunities. And what really matters is that civil society in its broadest sense, including the private sector, engages very heavily on this. I happen to be, linked to the B team of business leaders, and they are very engaged in taking these opportunities during the year. We Mean Business is becoming more influential in getting all major corporations to commit to being zero carbon in 2050. But what does this mean in 2030 and 2025, etc.? And then we have to get the oil and gas companies to switch much more quickly than they are doing out of. And unfortunately, I have to say, oil and gas companies are targeting African countries. And, I can understand that African leaders have to take their people out of poverty. But I know from my climate justice work, those who will suffer worst and first are their own people, if that happens. But it will also use up the carbon budget. And, the younger generation will not have a future. It's as serious as that.
It's also easy revenues for governments, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And therefore, what we need to see is the real solidarity of what was promised, the 100 billion a year to link with trillions in private financing, and also, the kind of solidarity of not just the investment in clean energy, but the technology, the know-how, the training. That all has to shift really dramatically. Sorry, we're out of time, but I feel, I'm not optimistic. I'm this prisoner of hope that Archbishop Tutu taught me to be, but I am more hopeful.
Very pragmatic. Your views, how do you leverage this, just briefly?
So very quickly, I think that one important point that we need to note is that South Africa's diplomacy on climate change has been very minimal at the moment, and it has to take a much stronger leadership as a build up to COP26. And also importantly, COP27 is going to happen in Africa. So that's a very important milestone that we have to build towards. And all of these discussions are quite relevant for that.
Thank you both very much. Time's run out. It's been a fascinating discussion at a time when climate issues feels like they really are gathering momentum and forcing the issue back onto the front pages. That's certainly our intention here in the world of serious journalism, and we look forward to future exchanges. For now, though, I really would like to thank my two guests, Mary Robinson and Saliem Fakir, for taking time out of their extremely busy schedules to join this webinar. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to everyone for sharing your questions with us. And once again, thank our sponsors, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Goodbye. This won't be the last discussion on climate change, I'm sure. Very, very grateful for joining us. Thank you. Be safe. Goodbye.